everyone. My name is Miko Bombeo. I'm part of this year's NDC Ad Core, and this is my contribution for the NDC lecture series. So I'm going to be talking about how to prep philosophy motions. So before I start, I'd like to put up two disclaimers. The first is that I am not a philosophy expert or like a philosopher. I did take a humanities course in my undergrad, but really I'm just someone who's generally invested and interested in philosophy motion specifically, because I think that they're really interesting. And I think that a lot of the times philosophy motions get a bad rap within the community. So hopefully through this lecture and through this discussion, we'll get to know a little bit more as to how we can best create case lines for philosophy motions. The second disclaimer is that this lecture is a combination of an introductory course and a supplementary course. So I'm going to assume that the people viewing this to a certain extent have knowledge of what a philosophy motion is, or has a general understanding of like what can be found within philosophy motions to begin with. But secondly, I also think that there are a few basic concepts such as how to prep these types of motions efficiently that will be discussed within this lecture that could generally benefit new debaters as well as older debaters. So as we go along, we're going to be talking about the different types or like a different type of philosophy motion later on, different strategies that you can employ in order to prep these types of motions, as well as a few like basic case lines or a few like basic formatting or things that you can think about during prep in order to help you prep more efficiently for these types of motions. So we're going to start with the first slide, and we're going to talk about how you define philosophy. And like we're going to ask ourselves the question why feel emotions generally exist. So philosophy within debate is a very broad and very vague term, primarily because a lot of ad cores set philosophy motions that generally deal with the human experience or just the experiences of humanity that lead toward like self-reflection and analysis as to the realities of life. And generally, philosophy motions ask debaters to introspect and analyze crucial parts of discussions within society that lead towards a better understanding of themselves or a better understanding of like how people interact with each other as well. And a lot of these discussions within philosophy motions exist primarily to act as like a criticism of a lot of realities within life, but also acts as a way for debaters to have that opportunity to self-reflect how their life contributes to certain social issues or how society affects maybe their stability, their mental health, or their ability to perceive empathy, to perceive like vague concepts such as love, such as death, for example. So if you were to define philosophy like in a phrase or in a sentence, you would probably say something along the lines of it being vague or being broad. But at the very core of philosophy motions, it's just a reflection of realities that can be found within society. So the next time that you see a philosophy motion, you can ask yourself, what part of the human experience does this specific motion talk about? And why is it something that is important to be discussed within a debate round or within like a tournament, for example? And philo motions exist not because they're like low impact or because they're not that relevant in comparison to other themes, but because it's also incredibly important to have that opportunity to like reflect on the human experience, to reflect on how you interact with society versus how society interacts with you, and how like certain aspects and certain concepts within society interact with each other and generate the perspective or the perceptions of individuals towards like their own life and how they lead it and how other people lead their lives as well. So in the next slide, we're going to talk about common misconceptions about philosophy. So the first is that you have to know about famous philosophers like Aristotle or Plato. Don't quote me on that. I'm also not sure which one of these people are philosophers. But generally, like I said earlier, philo motions are more about the human experience and less about actual schools of philosophy. So sure, there will be motions that ask you to look at like a utilitarian lens or like I forgot the alternative, the ontological lens, for example. But there will always be motions that also talk about genuine human experiences. This is like the motions that you get about love, for example, or recent motion, this house celebrates marupok culture, or other discussions that talk about like realities in the lives of other individuals. So if you think about it, feel emotions are feel emotions because you philosophize about human experiences, you philosophize about the interactions of humanity, you also philosophize about the intricate details of the lives of individuals, and like you try to understand why they make certain decisions, why they react in certain ways, and why they have these instances where decisions that they make tend to harm them, or why they have a tendency to choose one decision over the other. And really, it all just boils down to your ability to pinpoint those realities in the lives of these individuals, and to fully like dissect how you're able to manifest the reality or the truth of that individual within your debate speeches and within the cases that you give. The second common misconception about feel emotions are that they are generally low impact. And I would say that no motion is low impact, especially when it brings to light important conflicts and issues within society. So, in as much as there are motions that talk about like international conflicts, that talk about what's happening within the environment, that talk about economies, etc., there also must be motions that talk about the realities of the lives that people live on the ground. Uh, and I think that this is very important to talk about and to like analyze, because we rarely get opportunities to talk about these important issues as well. Like in society, sure, we do see on the news that like there are conflicts in different countries, for example, or that some countries are facing an economic downturn. But when do you have the opportunity to talk about how people feel or how people empathize with certain issues or certain like happenings within the world? Where do you get the opportunity to dissect why people make decisions or dissect the psyche of individuals? I think feel emotions provide a unique opportunity for debaters to do that in a way that is conducive, and also in a way that allows for them to fully dissect and fully analyze what really is the truth behind certain issues or truth behind certain discussions. Yeah, so the third misconception is that all feel emotions are generally just the same debate with different contexts. This is true to a certain extent, but it also follows for other like motion themes as well. So I think that all motion themes have generally like similar key clashes. The more that you move forward within the debate and the more experience that you gather, the more that you realize that motions and debates are just repetitions of crucial clashes or key clashes that a lot of people get to discover and get to like figure out as they go along within their debate career. And feel emotions are no different. But just because they have generally similar central clashes doesn't mean that they're low impact, or doesn't mean that all feel emotions are the same. Because you can analyze a key clash for a prefers a world motion, for example, and yet have a completely different debate that still boils down to that similar or like that crucial discussion with a different type of motion. So it all just depends on your ability, or the ability of like the judge or the debaters to tell a story as to why, for example, this debate is different from like other debates or other philo motions or other like philo analysis that exist within the debate community. And really, if all philo motions are the same, then generally people can run the same case line and still get the same results. But that doesn't usually happen because philo motions evolve and debaters evolve as well, and case lines evolve. So even with that like key clash intact, there are still a lot of discussions that revolve around um, like that clash without diverting from what makes it incredibly important as well. The last common misconception, and I think that this is something that is more common in like newer circuits, for example, or people who are just entering debate and get a philo motion, it's that you can win a philo debate just by being emotional. And to a certain extent, there is some truth to this, but as with all debates and as with all like analysis, content is still key. So your delivery and your ability to dissect the human experience in a way that is visceral, in a way that evokes emotion from your audience, is an important and valuable part of philo debates and is a very important discussion to raise within the debate community as well. But what makes it better and what elevates it to the extent where you tend to master philosophical motions and philosophical debates is your ability to use that emotion in order to drive the content of your case even further and to add on to the gravitas of that case and to add on to the like viscerality and the like emotionality of that discussion as a whole. So in general, if you have the ability to deliver your speeches in a way that is emotional, that tugs at the heartstrings of your judges, and also have the ability to have content that is actually important within the debate, you're well on your way to mastering how to prep for philo debates or just debate in general. Like other motions can also benefit from having an emotional delivery or even having like very like crucial and well thought out content that was delivered emotionally or delivered in a way that impacted the emotions of the judges or of the people that were listening to the speech. So a lot of these common misconceptions are because people are afraid of philo motions to a certain extent. Like I've heard the grumbles or the sighs of disappointment or fear back when it was like when we had physical tournaments every time a philo motion was released, because people were like, oh, another philo motion. We're going to talk about love or death or a mixture of both, maybe creating an entirely different world. And because of this like aversion generally to feel emotions, and because of this lack of preference for feel emotions within the community, people generate these types of misconceptions that really don't have a lot of truth to them. So as we go along through the lecture, we're going to be talking about different aspects of feel emotions and how we're more able to understand them, so that hopefully by the end, these common misconceptions disappear, or at the very least, are debunked to a certain extent. Okay, so the next slide is the first tip or the first discussion that I'll be talking about for philo motion specifically. And I'll be talking about the human experience and how we can make case lines out of these experiences. So I think that this is one of the simplest ways to start creating a case for philo motions, because in the spirit or in line with the interest of the creation of philo motions in the first place, where it's all just introspection and analysis of the human experience, the best way to create a case out of it is through examining the general human experience and assessing its applicability in the debate. So when you have a philo motion, you try to look at how you as an individual relate per se, or maybe just like how you generate a connection to the debate. It's relatively easier when you're talking about love, when you're maybe talking about like motions that ask you to assess the value or the importance of death within society. Maybe you're talking about the debate where you prefer a world where everyone was immortal. And it's really easy, it's relatively easy to have that type of analysis on lock, because as human beings, we already have general perceptions of love, of death, of empathy, of emotions, for example, and of relationships, if it's that type of emotion. But the usual arguments that can be made by assessing the human experiences or like human experience include like psyche analysis, the assessment of individual interactions with the general population. This just means how this individual feels when they interact with people that belong to a certain demographic, for example, like the interaction between an individual versus the movement that they belong in, or a movement that's trying to get their attention or their support, etc. Okay, so again, back to the discussion. I think one of the more important discussions that can be raised within the debate is using the analysis on motivations and outcomes. And this is especially important in actor debates, where you have to analyze not only the psyche of the individual or of the actor that the motion is asking you to discuss, but also the motivations behind the decision that they have to make. This is also really crucial in strategy debates as well, where you have to analyze why a certain strategy is better than the other and why the outcomes that come from that strategy is relatively better in comparison to whatever the opponent might run within the debate. And the last usual argument that can be like received or like analyzed from the human experience is the quality of life comparisons. And this is usually found in prefers a world debates where you create a generally new world from scratch and you have to analyze like the differences in values, differences in perceptions and lifestyles of individuals within the debate. And this is incredibly important because you're more able to have a foundational analysis using the quality of life comparisons if you're able to understand the human experience. So, the way that these types of arguments are used is generally to justify behavior, but also to justify perceptions and outcomes. So, when you use this type of analysis, you anchor onto the human experience. Like, for example, the suffering of a certain individual, the ability of people to process pain and emotion, how people channel that towards productivity, or maybe just channel that towards like relationships or other interactions within society, and how those outcomes relatively outweigh what currently is happening within status quo or whatever the burden of the opposition is to justify it. And when you have these types of analysis and when you have these types of comparisons, it's always important to use these discussions in a way that highlight the origin of these experiences and why these experiences like result into these outcomes in the first place. So when you do that, you allow yourself to have a foundation for all your other analysis within the debate. If you use human experiences, for example, to justify sympathy or to justify why a person would much rather like get rid of their emotions as opposed to like live in an emotional world, you use the experiences of individuals and you use that as a foundation, and you use it to push forward a lot of narratives that also exist and also benefit the actor or the like general world that you try to create within the debate. And the opposition or like the opposite of this is just to use the human experience as something that is a foundation for the stability of the values that you have. So, for example, if you're an op team that's defending status quo, the human experience is incredibly important for you to use in order to defend the sustainability of the benefits that you already have in status quo. So, for example, if you say emotions have allowed people to grow and have allowed them to develop their perceptions of relationship, of love, of death, etc., you can use the human experience that you already know exists within status quo and use that as the justification for a lot of your reasoning. So you say the reason why this is true and the reason why this is something that will continue to happen in the future is because human experience has proven that regardless of the amount of pain an individual experiences, like from relationships or from the loss of a loved one or maybe like other aspects within society, the human experience is that you're more able to like pick yourself back up, or you're more able to learn from these experiences as well. So a lot of the benefits that you get on the opposite side is already cemented and assured if you use the human experience as a foundation for this type of analysis. So the reason why this is the simplest way to like start creating a case for feel emotion, like feel emotions, is because it generally talks about something that is shared by everyone, and it's something that everyone has an intuitive way of understanding, and it leads to a better understanding of what the case is or what the motion is asking from you, whether you're on gov or op anyway. So this is generally like one strategy out of multiple like case lines or multiple strategies that you could employ. But I always say that the human experience is the best way or is the best tool to use in order to assess what the like emotions or what the reactions or motivations of actors are within philo debates, because you can't go wrong with using an analysis that everyone can understand and everyone can relate to. And in the world of philo debates where a lot of things are vague and a lot of things are unlike like uncertain and like ungrounded, the discussion of the human experience uh, tends to ground a lot of things for you and leaves you more room to create extensions that are more creative or create discussions that have multiple layers that support this type of discussion as well. Okay, so what are the things to prioritize in prep time when it's a feel motion? and you don't know what to think about because your thoughts are empty because it's another feel emotion. So the first thing that I tend to prioritize in philo, like prepping for a feel emotion, is the actors. Because generally it's just a first person perspective, but some debates might have specific entities that need to be considered. Like, for example, a fictional character, maybe a scientist that discovers the cure for all illnesses or the cure for cancer, or maybe a superpowered person, etc. And by honing into like a specific actor that you either want to benefit or you want to be within the debate, you're more able to use the strategy that we talked about earlier, which talks about the human experience. And when you have these types of analysis, and when you have the extents that you're able to establish through these actors, you're more able to create like different levels as to what the specific experiences of that individual or of that entity is, and how that leads towards like whatever you want to set up within the debate. So it's always a good idea to establish a specific entity that you want to examine or whose experiences you want to use within the debate, for example. And it's always a great idea to use this to your advantage and like establish the discussion in a way that benefits the interest of that actor, but also uses the experiences of that actor to the benefit of the debate as well. The second thing that you can prioritize in prep is to understand the impacts of the things that you do within your team. So, for example, you assess the significant change that's brought by the motion. You assess whether or not the decision that a person or the actor makes is something that yields towards benefits, or if there are harms that come from it, how you can mitigate these harms, for example, or how you can minimize the impact of these harms. And generally, just a discussion that revolve around why the impacts you create within your team are the most important. And I'd like to highlight that these types of analysis are most important in prefers a world motions, because a lot of the things or a lot of the case lines that come out of prefers a world motions tend to be generally ungrounded, or tend to be generally like uncharacterized to a certain extent, because it is a creation of a new world, like it's a total reset. So when you use impact analysis, or when you prioritize like prepping for impacts in your case, you already have that opportunity to constantly ground whatever your discussion might be, and also provide yourself the opportunity to build on those impacts and build on those benefits as well. Speaking of benefits, the last thing or the third thing that you prioritize in prepping for feel emotions are the likelihood of your benefits. Because one of the more difficult things to discuss within philo debates is the likelihood of the outcomes, of the benefits, or of the harms that you try to establish. Um, because there are a lot of discussions that are purely hypothetical. And because philo motions are generally hypothetical in nature, and it asks you to constantly assess whether this outcome is likely or not, prioritizing the likelihood of your discussions, of your benefits and harms, of your like impacts, etc., is a great way to like cement a lot of the benefits, or cement a lot of the discussions or arguments that you might create within the debate. So by prioritizing these three things, you allow yourself to have one, like a clear actor that does its work in order to achieve the outcomes or achieve the impacts for you. Two, you have clear impacts for the motion or for your team. So it generally leads to like less discussion on saying, oh, but the God sides discussion or op sides discussion isn't really that impactful. And three, you also already proved the likelihood of the benefits that lead towards the impacts that you discussed earlier. So it's more like it's relatively easier for you to create discussions from these three things that lead towards a good philo motion like prep case. Um, Again, this isn't like a end all be all guide to prepping for philo motions, because a lot of philo motions demand different things from individuals. But if you like encounter a philo motion that you generally don't have any idea how to debate, using these three things in prep time, or thinking about these three things in prep time, can really help streamline the process of thinking about what extension to run, or what like characterizations you need to establish, what benefits you want to achieve, etc. Okay, so next slide. Oh, here. Okay. So this motion is from THC debates in 2020. Shout out to Papat. This was their motion. And it was basically a motion that asked you to become a horse. So the info slide reads, upon your death as a human being, you discover the afterlife exists. Before being able to transition into your next life, you are given the choice to evolve into a god with a superior consciousness, powers, but increased levels of responsibilities and suffering relative to that experienced as a human being. Or you may choose to become a horse with less consciousness, less abilities, and less awareness about its own existence. As you transition into your next life, you will lose all consciousness, memories, and skills gained from your previous life. And the motion is this house would choose to become a horse. I remember when this motion came out, both teams in the semifinals chose this because it was an Asians motion. It was an Asians tournament. And a lot of people started tweeting about it on Twitter because Papa's really good at making feel emotions, and this is a relatively funny and interesting motion to debate on as well. But like when you try to dissect it and when you try to look at the crucial clashes of this motion, you realize that it's really just a discussion as to one, your responsibility as a human being based on your human experiences, whether you suffered to the extent where you would much rather lose like your awareness or your sentience, or you would have the responsibility to make lives better for other individuals. But it also assesses what the likely scenario is for an individual to be placed in a situation where they know of all the evils of the world, they know all of the suffering, all of the pain that happens, and what the likely choice for that individual is. And take note that the motion asks us to assess the choice in and of itself and not necessarily the actions that that individual will make after the choice. Because the info slide says that you're going to forget all your memories and skills and consciousness from your previous life. So it really is just an assessment of one event, and it doesn't really hyper focus on the events that happen after that choice. So when you start prepping these types of motions, you assess the frame, context, and characterization, which is what we just did, assessing the where the debate revolves around, what the debate wants us to solve or wants us to discuss, right? And then the next thing that you do is you evaluate the actor. So don't get too caught up with the horse. There's something deeper there. And the deeper meaning or the deeper analysis that we have is the ability of a person to make a decision based on previous experiences, and the ability of a person to either choose a less conscious life that is also relatively stress-free, unless you become like a horse in a glue factory or something, and is relatively like more freeing than the life that they have lived previously, or that individual deciding that it is also their responsibility to make sure that suffering for other individuals in the future doesn't exist, and therefore they choose to become a god regardless of the heightened responsibility and the heightened stress, because they want to have that ability to make sure that maybe suffering doesn't happen in the world that they are in charge of, maybe have the ability to alleviate or remove some of the evils that already exist within status quo. And this is an important step in assessing these types of motions, because if you're not able to analyze the psyche of an actor or the psyche of an individual making a choice, that choice will never be justified as the debate continues. So, in as much as you also have to justify the choice in and of itself, you also have to analyze the motivations of the actor in making that choice and in making that decision before proceeding to justifying why that choice is valid in the first place. So you have to understand why these decisions are important for these individuals, why these decisions are likely to be made, and what outcomes these individuals want to achieve when they make these types of decisions. So after you evaluate those actors, you assess status quo. So when you examine the human experience and evaluate what is being sacrificed and what is being gained, how do you justify the choice that you're going to be defending, either becoming a horse or becoming a god? And this is where debates evolve in philo debates, because everyone has different perceptions of what the genuine human experience is. So depending on how you perceive the like probable experience of this man turned horse or god, you're more able to analyze, or you're more able to understand the extents as to which the choice will lead to in terms of benefiting that individual or benefiting individuals that belong in that individual's world. So when you assess status quo, what do you hyper focus on? Will you hyper focus on the individual experience that that person might have had, having like traumatic experiences that lead towards them wanting to be freer, wanting to become a horse that runs around and gallops on the field and just eats grass? Or is this the type of analysis that revolves around the shared suffering and strife of humanity, where we're all stuck in COVID, where wars are happening on a daily basis, etc., and how you as an individual, when given this choice, you have the power to stop all of that. So this is where the assessment of status quo and the assessment of motivations also differ per team or per individual that's making a prep case for this motion. And that's the beauty of philo motions, right? You can create a single motion, but each debate that you observe has different discussions because different people have different experiences that lead to different types of analysis. And yet the key clash is still the same: having the opportunity to have a freer life, or having the opportunity to make life better for like everyone else, basically. And once you're done analyzing that, you just have to structure it by analyzing which discussions need to take priority over the others, why are they more important than other facets of the debate, etc. So that's how a normal philo motion prep goes. It's just a constant assessment of motivations, a constant assessment of outcomes, and a constant assessment of what is something that yields benefits the most within the debate, and how are we more able to get that, or why is that likely for us to achieve, or why is that the decision that is valid for us to make within the debate. Okay, so we're moving on. We're going to talk about how to prep this house prefers a world motions. And I think that this is an important thing to talk about within this lecture, because a lot of people find difficulty prepping these types of motions because they are unsure as to where the change happens. So hopefully this part of the lecture sheds some light on that, and also helps you like try to understand how to prep these types of motions as well. So there are three things that you need to do when you have a prefers a world. Like, how do you prefer a world? Because there's a lot of things that are wrong with this one. So the first thing that you have to do is to establish the reset. So when you debate the prefers a world motion, it almost always entails a reset from the world, or of the world, from the very beginning. And when you have a total reset, you also need to establish the differences between the world that you're trying to make and the world that you live in right now. So you establish differences immediately, such as like values, morals, principles, perceptions. Maybe some social movements don't exist in this world, but do in status quo. And this is important because this sets the difference between you and your opponent's case. Because if you're just debating within the same world, or debating within the same context, nothing really fully changes. Therefore, your benefit isn't really fully assured, or isn't really that beneficial anyway. So when you establish the reset as OG, for example, you create a world that benefits the values and perceptions that your team wants to have within the debate. Once you're done with that, you preempt the opponent's case, because sometimes the opponent's model is just status quo, the world that we're living in right now. But there will also be times where the motion asks the opposition to create a different world from scratch as well. So the type of motion, such as like, this house prefers a world where X is existing as opposed to a world where Y exists, it asks both sides to um, defend a world that they have to create from scratch as well. So when it comes to those types of motions, you have to understand what the differences are in a totally new world that your opponent will probably create as well. And if they don't create it, if they stick with status quo, then you can call them out and say that's not the burden that you're supposed to be fulfilling. You're supposed to create a different world with Y values, as opposed to our world that we also created with X values. And what that does is generally just provides you with a clearer like setup and also a clear foundation for your comparatives, which is the third thing that you have to think about and you have to prep for in preferential world motions. So when you have your comparatives, you need to establish these standards for assessment a little bit more concretely. And if this is done well, this leaves your opponent with less room to flip your case. So for example, if you already start comparing your world from the onset, like from prime minister's speech, you already start comparing values, you already start comparing perceptions. For example, why are people in our world relatively different in comparison to the world that you start creating or the opponent starts creating later on? You already have a strong foundation for future responses, future like extensions that you might want to bring up after your opponent establishes that case. And this is something that I also like highlighting when it comes to feel emotions as well, because you really can't preempt too early. A lot of people think that, or sorry, you really can't compare too early because a lot of people think that comparatives only happen once the first exchange of PM and LO is over and you have a clear picture of what the differences are. But if you try to preempt, or like if you want to have a more intuitive case as opening government, even, or even as opening opposition, and you try to preempt the case of the opponent early on, and you start your comparisons um, at prime minister, you spend less time later on at DPM trying to establish those comparatives or trying to establish that difference setting. And you have more time to talk about your extensions, you have more time to present your responses, you have more time to generally just debunk the case that your opponent tries to create within the debate. So that's how you prep, or that's how you like look at or approach a preferential world motion. I think the next one is an example. Yeah. So this one is a preferential world motion that I think I got from a friend. I just asked them what their favorite feel emotion was. So the motion says, or the motion reads, this house prefers a world where stoicism is the norm. So stoicism is basically just like not allowing for things to make you emotional, like approaching a lot of things within life in a very like comprehensively stoic manner or in a way that isn't emotional, in a way that is calculating and more pragmatic, as opposed to allowing for things to dictate how you're supposed to feel. So this motion, because it's a prefers a world motion, asks the debaters within the round to enter the debate and analyze it in a way that um, makes sure that stoicism has always been there. So since birth, like children, babies approach life in a stoic manner, where they when they don't get the toy that they want, they don't cry about it. Instead, they try to understand why they didn't get the toy that they want, for example. It's a relatively interesting debate, but we're going to talk about how we can dissect it and how we can create like cases for both like gov and op um, for this specific type of motion. So we already know that it's a total reset. So people from the onset of the creation of the world, however that may have happened, we're always stoic, or at the very least, it's very unlikely or it's very uncommon for a person to be emotional in the world of government or in the world of OG. Whereas in the world of OO, you have the option to either like have people as like completely emotional, or like where stoicism isn't the norm, or you just live in status quo where stoicism is something that people discover through self-reflection, maybe through reading self-help books, going to therapy, like reading things on the internet, and then them deciding that this is the lifestyle that I want to lead, right? So when you establish that and when you already understand the reset, you evaluate the actors. So generally in this debate, the actors or the actor is humanity as a whole, because you're resetting the world. You're trying to prove which world yields more benefits, like maybe productivity wise, or maybe like where are people more able to generate more meaningful connections, or maybe like better relationships, etc. And how you approach it is generally talking about what makes stoicism something that is more valuable when it's the norm versus when people have to discover it and constantly practice it in their day to day. So you try to think about how stoicism has affected people in their day to day. Like, are Stoics generally better at managing their emotions? Are Stoics generally better at understanding or empathizing with other individuals? these types of discussions or these types of analysis are crucial in order to assess the benefits that you want to establish for this specific type of motion. And when you translate that into a world where stoicism has been in existence or has been a norm, you try to apply it on a day-to-day basis where people always have access to the benefits that it provides. So probably in the world of OG, you would say something along the lines of a world where stoicism is the norm is a world where people aren't like led or directed by their emotions. Like their emotions don't dictate a lot of their decisions. They're cold, yes, calculating, of course, but the decisions that they make are inherently pragmatic in nature, and they make decisions based on the overall net good benefit as opposed to making decisions that are based on emotion, that are based on like sentiments or sentimental values or like sympathy, etc., which might yield or lead towards outcomes that aren't as beneficial for people in general. So, really, who is more likely to win within the debate? A world where people are more stoic, or a world where people aren't or have to discover it on their own? And then you assess status quo, of course. So, what makes status quo worse or better, depending on which side you are on? And then you structure your case. You present it comparatively, and you constantly assess the differences. And this is why I talked about trying to preempt the opponent's case earlier. Because if you manage to do that and you already talk about the preemption and the comparison at PM speech, the material that come out from your opponents is something that you can immediately adapt to, or is something that you can like analyze without having to fully understand or without having to take the time to digest whatever it is your opponents are trying to say. So you have more time for a lot of the constructive material that you might want to give within the debate as well. Yeah. So integrating philo analysis into other themes. So this is like the last part of the lecture. We're going to talk about how you can use philo analysis in other debates like econ, IR, environment, etc. And it might sound weird, but it also makes sense because in a lot of other themes or in a lot of other motions, especially in actor motions, in other themes, generally people either have to assess strategy, have to assess impact, have to assess like motivations behind choices, etc. And when you have a well honed skill for making philo analysis, it makes things relatively easier to justify or relatively easier to explain. So this is how you do it. It's great for principle grounding because the analyses that is related to philo motions or to philosophy in general, aka psyche analysis, like motivations, as I said earlier, or maybe just frameworks behind concepts, make for good backbones to principled arguments. I remember there was this one tournament that I joined where the motion was this house regrets home ownership. And the case that I ran with my partner was to talk about the philosophy of ownership, how owning a home generally locks you into a situation where you are unable to change exponentially. So when you own a home, for example, if I purchase a condo in Mandaluyong, I'm gonna have to live my life in Mandaluyong because I have a property there. Therefore, I have to format my life around the decision of owning a home versus like being a digital nomad, for example, where you can build your life everywhere else. And the principle behind it is just that it's generally more freeing. We lost that round, but it was a very novel like type of argument that you can create and maybe even improve upon in future in future debates. So don't try to use philo extensions or philo arguments on their own, because it's going to be, especially in a round that talks about economy, like our opening half talked about not tariffs, like mortgages and how expensive the like home ownership industry is nowadays, or how expensive it is to own a house. So don't do that, especially if you have that type of like pragmatic analysis from your opening. Instead, try to use philo analysis to justify motivations. So in that motion, for example, try to use the philosophy of ownership as a way to analyze what motivates an individual to purchase a house in the first place, or to purchase a home, or to live their life as a digital nomad, and how that affects their ability to have sustainability in the future, either financially or like generally just being a stable human being, right? So when you use it as like supplementary to your principle that you want to establish, it's relatively easier to integrate within the debate. And it's also relatively easier to expand upon as well if the debate continues to like go in that direction and your opponents try to bite that analysis. And if your opponents don't, then you can call them out on it as well and say, well, we talked about this, but they didn't respond to it. So like it adds on to the extent or the quality or like the number or amount of discussions that you can bring within the debate. The second thing is that it's also a useful alternative for closing extensions. So it's the same as the principle grounding discussion. So these types of analyses can also be used by closing teams, and this is particularly effective if opening half focused on pragmatics primarily. Again, it's not advised that you use it as your main extension, but if it's a movements motion, for example, and opening half talked about like getting the numbers for the movement or like swaying the moderates, etc. Like those types of analysis, like very pragmatic, looking at pragmatic outcomes, pragmatic benefits. As a closing team, you have the opportunity to use a psyche analysis to analyze the motivations of like maybe figureheads within the movements, or maybe just the psyche of a movement in general, like as a collective, why they have priorities that are like this, as opposed to prioritizing whatever your opponent tries to discuss. And when you have these types of discussions and when you have these types of analysis, it helps clarify a lot of the missing links that happen from opening half. So if opening half is incredibly pragmatic and they focus heavily on benefits that are reliant on like policy changes or like getting more votes, getting more attention, etc., try to take a step back and look at what leads towards this movement wanting more votes in the first place, and why that principle and why that like philosophical concept justifies their ability to achieve or to choose or to make a decision or to choose a strategy that leads towards these pragmatic benefits. Um, this isn't this isn't to say that you should do this in every single round, but if you have a hard time, like for example, your opening half is really good and they exhausted all the possible like pragmatic discussions, and but they didn't focus on like a principle, this is where you can enter and at the very least present a fresh perspective within the debate. And this can happen in different themes, like not just movements. You can talk about it in IR, in econ, like in art, NFT motions, even though like I really don't like NFT motions, and other types of motion themes where you can look for a principle, look for a philosophical justification for that principle, and use that as grounding and use that as a foundation in order to support your other analysis within the debate as well. Okay, so that's the end of the lecture. I'm gonna leave you with this quote that I got from a good friend and also someone who trained us for a little bit in 2018, or 2019 rather. Her name is Marian Chongson. She's from UPM, and she told us in a lecture or like in a opening like discussion to our training that it takes 10,000 hours of repetition to become a master of something. So in debate, you need to invest like 10,000 hours in order for you to master a certain skill. But in philosophy debates, because you're using the lives or like the human experience as a way to justify a lot of your arguments, as like a way to justify a lot of your discussions within the debate, you're technically a master already because you've been living your life for longer than 10,000 hours. So you have the best ability to assess your understanding of what your life is, what human experiences are. You've spent more than 10,000 hours like being a human. So generally, you have a clear understanding or like a clear pathway towards that understanding of the human experience. And it's relatively easier for you as well to like garner some visceral reactions or like get motivations or analysis from your experiences because you know these experiences like the back of your hand. So that's all for the lecture. If you have any questions, you can contact me through Facebook on Messenger. My name is Miko Bombeo. You can also contact me on Discord. That is my Discord handle. It's Miko #0711. I'm not a convenience store, unfortunately, but if it's convenient for you, then I can answer your questions on Discord. Oh, yeah. Okay. Thanks so much, everyone, for watching this lecture. I hope you learned a thing or two about feel emotions, and I'll see you in the tournament. Bye bye.